everybody. Welcome to this presentation on Unpacking Complexity, Analyzing Complexity in the Dynamics of Trafficking. Just starting my timer there. So just an introduction to the presentation. This presentation is specifically regarding the dynamics of trafficking. The more we work on the issues of trafficking, the more I think we realize, which I'm sure you may agree with me on, the more we realize how trafficking connects to so many other areas of life situations, social structures, political relationships, and so many different trends and stories in communities. It's almost like trafficking can touch any different part of the way of life in any given context, country, or community. And while we're working in anti-trafficking, in order for us to really be effective in our work, to make a difference, often we need a way to work with the complexity, which doesn't simplify the issues, respects the complicated nature. And so we need a way to unpack the complexity and in a way that we can put it back together, but at least unpack it so that we can understand what the real issues are, where we can make the most difference, and therefore where we, in each of our roles, in each of our organizations, can make, the most difference, the most impact. So this is really my motivation for this presentation. It's to really kind of share the ways in which the dynamics of trafficking, the complexity of trafficking can be better analyzed. So just a little bit about us and me. We are Embode. I am the founder and I am the director of Embode, which is an international agency providing consultancy, mainly research in various areas of human rights, but in particular, social protection, issues around forced labor, migrant labor, child labor, human trafficking, particularly in supply chains. We also analyze systems and organizations, and this is some of where the inputs that I will be sharing in this presentation come from. So we work in multiple countries. At least we've worked in at least over 12 countries already in the last 6 years, across Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa. And we've worked on many different issues, from migrant labor in palm oil to child labor in cocoa, workers in garment factories, and so forth. Our clients are UN agencies, corporate businesses, as well as NGOs, both local and international. So we work with and for a whole host of different types of organizations. Myself, I've had about 20 years of experience working in anti-trafficking, starting in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia, working on issues of sexual exploitation of women, and then moving back to the UK, working in law enforcement, civil service, and police policy and intelligence, focusing on child trafficking in the UK. And then for the last 10 years, I've been back in Southeast Asia working on child protection, focusing on issues of child exploitation, and of course, then with Embode. But you can learn all about us at our website, which I'll share with you before the end of the presentation. So for the purposes of this, this presentation that I want to share with you, is I'll be using two case studies from research we conducted for the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. They focused on Indonesia and Ethiopia. And the main focus of the research, excuse me, I'm just recovering from a cold. The main purpose and the focus of the research was to look at the interplay of social norms and stigma in relation to trafficking, mostly in terms of how social norms and stigma contribute to putting people at risk of trafficking, as well as how social norms and stigma impacted the success or non-success or failure of reintegration of survivors of trafficking once they returned home from their destinations. So I'll be using these two pieces of research as case studies for what I want to present to you, the method for unpacking complexity, that method for unpacking and identifying dynamics. As I mentioned, these are just two case studies, but if you're looking at understanding some of the other dynamics we've we've been working on and identifying and assessing. Again, you can go to our website. You may be interested in some of the work we've been doing in migrant labor in Malaysia in the palm oil sector, where we've actually analyzed systems and the interplay of dynamics in recruitment, particularly from Nepal to Malaysia in the palm oil sector, but also in terms of child labor in West African countries like Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, as well as workers in Vietnamese garment factories in the main cities. And we've uncovered not hidden because they're intentionally hidden, but underlying dynamics that are so important in order to understand, in order to actually realize what kind of responses would be best. Too often, we are seeing organizations working on responses to trafficking, which really respond to a simplified idea of what's happening rather than an actual understanding of what's happening. So, yeah. So social norm, just to iterate, a social norm is defined as a behavioral rule. It's usually informal, and it is on a behavioral rule on what is considered acceptable and non-acceptable, within society. Stigma might be defined very generally, might be defined as a social disapproval, and it may manifest as attitudes and reactions to what is considered in a community to be disgraceful or defective. So this is what we were focusing on for this research. So that's just as an example. So now getting back to what we mean by complexity. What do I mean by complexity? Well, first of all, let's look at the dimensions of analysis. When we're looking at dynamics, what are we talking about? When we want to analyze dynamics, how do we analyze dynamics? Well, one of the first things to say is, what on earth are we talking about when I'm saying dynamics? Let's start with human trafficking. We know that human trafficking does not occur in a vacuum. A number of factors come into play across historical, cultural, social, and interpersonal levels to create a situation where trafficking of persons takes place. The interplay of these factors at all levels are what I am, or what we call, dynamics. Observation of the interplay of these factors or dynamics can reveal patterns, insights, and focus for better action to better respond to trafficking. Now, one of the definitions I would propose of what is complexity is the moving parts of these dynamics, the constant movement of these dynamics, and there is no ever static situation. It's the uncertainty of how these dynamics can cause and manifest as a risky situation that turns into abuse, exploitation, trafficking. As I mentioned, simplifying what is complex can lead to actions, projects, interventions that at worst might exacerbate the situation and at best don't make much of a difference at all, at least not sustainably in the long term. So this is why I'm an advocate for leaning into complexity, for leaning into being in the question, being in the inquiry, and suspending judgment and not giving final answers to things. So that's my approach, having worked in issues of sexual exploitation, child labor, and all such areas of trafficking. Whenever we've simplified and put the issue in a box, and then we come up with a solution, it doesn't seem to work. We're still in the same place 10, 20 years' time. But I can't go much further into that right now, but let's get back to what I mean by dimensions for analysis. So for analysis, I recommend that we have 3 levels or 3 dimensions at which we look at the situation. So if you take a moment and think about the area of trafficking or social protection that you're working in, or just pick one of the areas, pick one of the trends or situations that the people that you take care of or the organization that you work in or is based in is looking at. So the contextual dimension relates to the macro level factors. The macro level factors of the situation. What is the history, the culture, the sociology, economic situation, and political situation of the context you're looking at? So if you're looking at a particular country, a particular community, if you are in a destination country, looking at issues of trafficking, you may even want to know, why are so many children or women or men being trafficked to this country from that country? So you might look at a source country and you might think, well, what's the history of that country? What's the culture of that country? What's the political situation of that country? Then we have systemic dimension. The systemic dimension is what I call meso factors. This relates to systems which people, and this could be the victims or the survivors of trafficking, or it could be other actors in the trafficking situation. It could be agents, it could be traffickers, it could be family members. But what systems are they a part of? Because all of us are part of systems. We're at least all part of family systems, community systems. How do we relate to local government systems, national departments of government? How are we involved in businesses, either as customers or workers or employees? How are the businesses involved in supply chain systems? And then you have civil society, you have organizations, you have academic institutions, schools, and of course you have informal systems. You have networks, you have informal networks of people that belong to certain, ethnicities, certain cultures, as well as groups of people like volunteer networks of migrant workers. Then we have the biographical dimension. This is what I might also call personal or person level micro factors. You might be thinking about people that you serve, survivors of trafficking or other actors involved in the trafficking context or situation. What is their personal social identity, their gender, their race, their ethnicity? How does their labeling or putting into a box of their personal social identity, whether it's ethnicity, race, religion, age, how does that relate to the way they may have been conditioned about how they should behave and be? And what about their relationships and their desires, their personal aspirations, and other life events that happen? So this really gets into specific cases and looks at individuals and their own experience and domain. So these are the three levels of or dimensions of analysis that I'm proposing we need to look at when we want to unpack the complexity of trafficking or any social situation. So now I'm going to go a bit more in depth into each of these using the case studies. So what do we mean by contextual factors? As I mentioned, this provides a background. Which country are you talking about? What is the statistics of that country? What's the population size? How many of that population live in the rural areas regarding or vis-a-vis urban areas? What's the geography of the country like? How is the country developed or not? What is the history of the country? At least the most immediate history, at least in the 21st or the last few decades. What is the political history of the country, the economic history of a country? When I think of a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, they were very different economically or socioeconomically speaking, 20 years ago. We've seen a huge rise in access to education in some of the more developed Asian countries, from India to Indonesia to Thailand. This has had a huge impact on issues such as, child trafficking and child labor. And this is really important. So understand the history of the country, the people, the situation. And then it's important to understand the background culture of people and the differences in inter-ethnic, inter-religious relationships in the country, in the context you're talking about. And as I mentioned, not just the political situation at the national level, but also at local and inter-community levels. So how did we apply this when we were doing our research in Indonesia and in Ethiopia? So let's start with Indonesia. We understood that, Indonesia is the largest economy in Southeast Asia. That Indonesia has undergone major structural transformation in recent decades, but yet there is significant income inequality across the country. 25.9 million Indonesians still live below the poverty line. So even though looking objectively, Indonesia is a great success over the last 2 decades, what we're seeing is that a lot of people are still in very desperate situations. And we know that those people that are in those difficult situations use labor migration as a strategy for poverty alleviation. It's one of the biggest, most common used strategies for families and communities to lift themselves out of poverty. And to some extent, it's had quite a lot of success. 9 million Indonesians are working overseas. And according to government statistics, 70% of those documented Indonesian migrant workers are women, which then shows a great feminization of labor migration. This is very important to understand when we're starting to look at the issue of trafficking, social norm, stigma in a given region in Indonesia. We also know that in that region in Indonesia, we were looking at Sumba, Southwest Sumba and South Sumba. And in that region, cultural traditions tend to focus very much on gender-based norms. There are particular roles for men as head of households and particular roles for women as homemakers. Men are seen as strong leaders, and women are seen as helpers. And in this particular region, the cultural traditions put a very high value on families holding ceremonies called pesta adat. And this is a very important role that families take in the community, even though it can leave people in high levels of debt. And for sociological reasons, a lot of that debt might fall on the woman to then pay off, which we can look at a bit later. So these are some of the contextual factors that we identified. In Ethiopia, we also know it's one of the fastest growing economies in Africa, but yet globally, it's one of the poorest. We know that it's a landlocked country with the second most populous, it's the second most populous country in Africa with 109 million people. And yet Ethiopia faces internal conflict across some of its regions, as you may have known from the news in the last few months. It faces high levels of unemployment, particularly in rural areas. And because of the lack of access to basic services in rural areas, children are, dropping out of school early. People are in a desperate situation where they're looking to leave to find, a better life for themselves. And this creates, a situation where, again, labor migration is used as a strategy for poverty alleviation, yet it's a different context to Indonesia. It happens in a very different way, which we'll see in a moment. So that's how we would analyze contextual factors. Obviously, one would go a lot more in depth in studying these, but it's helpful to start there. And these are just some examples I'm using. So what do we mean by systemic factors? I already mentioned systemic factors or systemic dimension for analysis is the groups that we are a part of, the groups that people are a part of. All of us live and exist in systems. This is the domain that we're occupying all of the time. We can exist in multiple systems. I can be part of my family, and I can also be going to school, and I can also be, working in an organization and belong to my religious group, and so forth. So systemic factors look at, the dynamics in that given group. Once you have identified the family systems, the community systems, the religious systems, and all the others, and then you've also identified formal systems, local government services, NGOs, businesses, supply chains. You've got a whole plethora of different systems that people have roles in. Once you identify a system, you can identify the role. The role is that part of the person that's engaged with that system, either as a customer, as a member, as a contributor, as a worker. You can then see why and how people behave in certain ways when they are part of a system. So that's where the role comes along. When we were looking at systemic factors in the research, we found some very, very interesting trends. For Indonesia, for example, we found that in the family, females were being undervalued for their work compared to men. It started from birth, where sons are preferred over daughters. And although women do contribute to household income, it is not considered, equal to the contributions of men. But then at a community level, women are further disempowered through cultural norms, such as when women are married, a bride price is paid for them from the husband to the woman's family in exchange for the woman. And in some ways, that might smack of, buying and selling of women. It's a cultural practice, and it is called a bride price. So in some ways, the women are seen to be bought unconsciously, or not at a kind of explicit level, but implicitly. And this goes into the psyche of a lot of women, and in the way that they feel indebted to their husbands, who very often get into debt when they have to pay the bride price. Women are also encouraged to put the needs of others first, and they require social permission to make major decisions. We also found that in the migration network, in the system of migration, because there's quite a lot of out-migration from this area to other countries, particularly to Malaysia for domestic work, labor intermediaries were considered heroes, rather than being seen with suspicion. Brokers, rather than being seen with suspicion or mistrust, they were actually considered quite well, they were very well regarded in the local community. And we found that this was a very interesting dynamic and a very interesting factor. These men were considered heroes because they were helping people, lift their families out of poverty. They are men, and they are therefore in a very strongly patriarchal society, vis-a-vis migrants that want to go, most of whom are women. They hold quite a superior position, whereas women that want to migrate might be in a more submissive position, because their status in the community is generally lower than men, but particularly lower than labor intermediaries, who they just have to listen to and do what they're told. So that was a very interesting systemic factors and dynamics we found in Indonesia. Now looking at Ethiopia, even though this might sound similar, and in some ways it is, it's important to remember this is a completely different country in another part of the world. But what we found was in the community, there were patrilocal marriage system, meaning that communities and families were less invested in girls' education, and also girls also bear the burden of domestic responsibility, caring for their siblings, fetching water, and all kinds of domestic responsibilities. Women are also burdened with supporting the family, even though in some ways that falls mostly on men, but because of the feminization of migration, you're finding that women are increasingly taking up the responsibility to provide for the family. And again, in the migration network, in the chains of migration, what we found was a very interesting dynamic, where there was a difference between the way that the women transited in migration compared to the way that men migrated or transited for labor migration, and it differed. And we found the reason for that was because with women, they were entering a more formalized migration process, where their papers were all regularized, and they were we found a trend where many women were being recruited for domestic work in the Middle East, and so they would leave with formal papers and everything, whereas for the men there was no job at any particular destination, and men were engaging more in irregular migration, and therefore taking riskier transit routes across countries, which left them at much higher risk of violence, abuse, and trafficking. So women were flying to their destinations and men were going on land. And this was a very interesting dynamic we found in Ethiopia. Of course, I'm going over these in a very summarized way. So if you'd like more information, I would encourage you to read the reports. So now looking at biographical factors. Now, if you're looking at your trafficking situation, you've looked at the context, you've looked at the systems that people are aware of or are part of. And there's so many systems to look at, from the cultural and community systems to the formal government systems. It's interesting to do a mapping. That's what often we do, is a bit of a mapping. Mapping, what I call, is actually plotting a chart to see how each of these systems work with each other and how they interrelate in the backdrop of the context. So now if we look at biographical factors, what are we talking about here? As I mentioned, this is the dimension of the person's experience as an individual in relation to their relationships, their systems, and their context. This is the part where we're talking about the experience of being an individual, the part where we're looking at a person and thinking of him or her. It could be a victim or a survivor of trafficking. It could be an agent, a witness, any other actor involved in the trafficking situation. What can you see about their gender, their age, their ethnicity? What do you understand about how their social identifying features condition them to behave and act in certain ways? And what might be projected on them because of their social identity? What assumptions do people make about, girls of that age or men of that religion, And then because of those social identifiers, what types of relationships do they have? Very often we might look at trafficking and think about the story that happened after they migrated. But it's so important to look at a person's story before they decided to migrate. Why did they leave home in the first place, for example? And this is where their capabilities, skills, and education come into play. That's why we also look at, the level of dropout of school, because we assume that the longer that somebody's been in school, the more empowered and knowledge that they have. But also, what are their personal desires and their aspirations? And what other significant life events occurred for them before, during, and after their migration or trafficking experience? So these are very important to look at. So what did we find when we looked at biographical factors? These were all areas of questioning when we did our interviews, which we delved into in a safe and ethical way. So for Indonesia, we found that only women had migrated and fallen into trafficking situations from this region. So we were curious about why we only found women. This study wasn't only looking at women, but in Indonesia, we only found women. And we found that, biographically, we found that a lot of women expressed themselves in a way that led us to believe that violence in their life was normalized. For example, one woman talked about how she had been locked up in Malaysia. She was working in a pet shop and she'd been locked up for a few hours. And when asked about how she felt about that and whether it was wrong, she said that she felt that that being locked up was justified as a punishment because she had made a mistake, which was quite confronting to think. You think it's okay to be locked up for a few hours because you broke a piece of glass or something. So this kind of normalization of violence was kind of expressed in different ways. We also found that a lot of migrants that were returning back to Indonesia, or this region of Indonesia, would, at least at first, undergo some level of stigmatization, especially if they were thought to have been in some kind of unethical kind of work. But in particular, when migrants come back and they don't have all the money that they were supposed to have come back with, they're seen as failed migrants and they're blamed. In Ethiopia, we found a really interesting, we found some very interesting things regarding why men, for example, even though they face such extreme violence, some horrific cases we identified in Ethiopia of young men taking treacherous journeys across, across North Africa, and trying to get into Europe, for example. People being thrown off ships and boats and being raped and all kinds of things, and their families being blackmailed back home while they're en route, being smuggled across borders. We found that even though a lot of men came back with these horror stories, if they survived at all, there were still more men that were willing to make the decision to migrate in such violent conditions because they felt that the desire to improve their lives outweighed the risk of trafficking. This was very, very interesting. It was very confronting, and it's important to suspend judgment, to be curious about this. There is a risk, even though it feels like there is a choice. I mean, even though it might feel a choice between a rock and a hard place, but a choice is being made nevertheless. And that's important, apart from legal definitions and things like that. So it's important to see the human story, behind. We also found that similarly in Ethiopia, when survivors of trafficking returned home, that if they didn't come with, bag loads of money, that they were blamed for failed migration. There was a further level of, stigmatization and mental distress felt by survivors of trafficking, because coming back from a migration situation, particularly for men, for example, where they had been blackmailed and their families had to get them out of worse conditions that they had left in than before they left, families were found sometimes in more debt than before. And so even though these young men might have left with aspirations to help their family, they left their families in a worse position. So this is incredibly distressing for young returnee migrants, and the shame that they would face was unbearable in a lot of situations. So you found extreme levels of mental anguish and issues. So this is what we found at the biographical level, at a very personal level. And this is just some of the stories I'm telling you. As I mentioned, it would be very good for you if you wanted to learn more to read the reports, where we've included some case studies as well. So now that we've looked at the contextual level analysis, or the contextual factors, we've looked at systemic factors, and then we've looked at biographical personal factors, how do we thread it all together to distinguish key themes and patterns? I'll give you some examples. So one of the ways in which I do this, and maybe you can take these questions for yourself as well, is to ask questions. So what patterns and common dynamics have been identified? The first thing to do is always look for patterns. What patterns have we seen here? Well, one of the things that we saw is we found a pattern of where migrants are constantly leaving, or in certain pockets are leaving without permission. And it was a trend, for example, in Indonesia. There was a whole bunch of women that would just leave without permission, even though it was required. And in Ethiopia, we were looking at two particular regions. And in one region, young people were leaving for migration, without getting consent from their parents, which was noteworthy. So how might we understand this? In the Indonesian context, for example, we found, okay, so we have a context where labor migration is used as a poverty alleviation strategy. So there is a pull, there's a demand for migrant labor, say in Malaysia. So these women have a way to get out of that, a way to go into their labor migration to their destination to get a job. But at the same time, the community where they come from disempowers them. So on one hand, they've got an opportunity to get a job in another country and make something of themselves, so to speak. And on another level, where they are, they're disempowered. So here you've got women making a choice, saying we're going to use our personal agency to circumvent the rules, which was a very interesting dynamic. Another question to ask is, how do contextual factors explain why some people are more powerful than others? It's very important to look at power dynamics, especially when we're talking about exploitation and trafficking. Who has more power? Who has less power? So how does the context explain who has more power? As we noticed, labor intermediaries in Indonesia and brokers had a lot of power, and they had more power than migrants. The way to explain that is the systemic domination of men over women in this region, the personal level of conditioning of the submissiveness of the women, and a context where all the migrants are women because of the demand for domestic workers in Malaysia and the control of local administrative systems in women in the the origin community. So these are the different dynamics at context, system, and personal level that come together to then explain why labor intermediaries have more power. It explains a little bit more about that power dynamic, which helps us then to think about, well, if we wanted to change the dynamic here, what would we have to do if we took a few steps back to change that dynamic between labor, brokers, and aspiring migrants? At the same time, why are some people more vulnerable? So we've looked at why some people are more powerful, but how does contextual factors explain why some people are more vulnerable? One thing we learned is that aspiring migrants tend to have left school early. It tells you quite a lot. A lot of these migrants are coming from areas which have high levels of poverty compared to the rest of the country, whether we were talking about Indonesia or whether we were talking about rural parts of Ethiopia. And in these rural parts of the countries, particularly the ones that we're talking about, you have less access to basic services. So that probably means not a great level of education. And so you've got a certain level of disillusionment, perhaps, with education, a lack of culture and resources to finish school, and the possibility of making something of your life by leaving school and migrating. So that's what makes some people more vulnerable, because they don't finish school, they don't have access to good quality school, and another option is shown to them that in some ways might even seem, I don't know, easier. That's a hypothesis to look into. Another question to ask is, what are the risk factors that trigger vulnerabilities into events that lead to exploitative situations? Well, one thing we found was a normalization of violence and submissive behavior as a strategy to avoid being in a violent or abusive situation. Now, if women are consistently educated to be submissive as a way of avoiding conflict, then it contributes to a normalization of violence. We've seen in the context, the position of men and women. We've seen in systems, the debts that are put on women to pay off for what they were bought for. And we've seen also women, dismissing the violence that they experienced by saying, oh, that punishment was worth it. So these are the risk factors which trigger the vulnerabilities, which then lead to women being more at risk of exploitative situations, because they don't see it as exploitative. They just saw this as a valid punishment. How do systemic factors contribute in exacerbating or failing to protect risk factors? Well, one of the things, just focusing on government as systems, because we can look at all kinds of systems, but there was a lack of adequate local government services and a capacity to deal with, people that want to migrate, the remoteness of these areas, the lack of information, the lack of formalized mechanisms, and the overall lack of resources. So once we can understand the interplay of dynamics, we can understand the context system and biographical, then the interplay of them, we start getting some real stories, we start getting some real dynamics, which we can, look at, reflect on, and think about, right, now what action do we take? Now, in the way that we do it as a research agency, we make recommendations, but recommendations need to be realistic. They need to consider the reality of the context, the reality of the system, and the personal biographies. We don't just recommend compliance with laws. The laws can be the best in the world, but very often in many of these countries, these laws aren't enforced. There's obviously reasons for that. So rather than recommend or advocate for compliance of laws, which governments would do if they could, how about seeking creative ways that local and national government can better enforce laws through pooling resources and collaborations? Often, a lot of the reasons why laws can't be enforced is because of a lack of resources. So how about memorandums of understanding between government departments where they can pool their resources? Or even memorandums of understanding between sectors, business and government sector, NGO and business sector. So these memorandums of understanding, what I'm calling MOUs, they're just agreements to collaborate, to share resources, to share knowledge. This can also be a great learning opportunity too. This is why we veer away from just recommending compliance with laws. I think the law is there. Recommending compliance isn't going to take us anywhere further. I mean, that's my personal view. I also propose not to recommend just better services for victims. I see that a lot. What you need is to use existing resources, existing networks and systems, and empower them to support their members. As we've seen, these survivors, these people, they are already members of their families, of their churches, of their religious groups, of their, of various systems. How can these community resources be harnessed in a way that helps them reduce risk to unsafe migration, which could lead to trafficking, or to better reintegrate them when they come home, whether or not they are seen as failed or successful migrants? So we've recommended support groups, and we've given some ideas about how support groups can be used, especially linking, returning migrants with other returning migrants. These kinds of informal systems can often have such a deep and lasting impact on people. And rather than setting up something new and elaborate, costing millions of dollars, how about using the resources that are already existing? Also, don't just recommend capacity building. In the last 20 years, we've seen a lot of training being given by those who are in the know to people that are supposedly, not in the know. And this kind of simplistic dynamic where you have training from those that have the knowledge to those that apparently don't have the knowledge, not sure how effective that has been in the long term. How about seeking ways in creative, not that training doesn't always, I'm not making a blanket statement. I don't mean to make a blanket statement on training, but often training is overused as a strategy when there are other also creative ways of sharing existing expertise, secondments, coaching, secondments across organizations and sectors, coaching over time. There's lots of ways in which existing champions in different organizations can be, given a platform to share what they know. So working on good practices and building on good practices. So this is just a very quick whistle-stop tour. It's already almost 45 minutes. But if you would like more information about all of our reports, as I mentioned, this is our website. If you want to keep up to date with what Embode is doing, feel free to follow us on LinkedIn. That's where we give most of our updates on various reports, presentations, and webinars that we might be engaged in. Wishing you all the best for the rest of this conference. And I wish you some very insightful discussions now. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, you can get in touch and I can get back to you, the week after. But thank you for your attention. Bye.